Welcome to All Right in Sin City, a podcast about writers and writing in the Windsor-Detroit region. Your podcasters today are
Sarah Jarvis, former bookseller, publishing rep, and literary festival chair.
Kim Conklin, Windsor-based writer and filmmaker.
And me, Irene Moore Davis, author, educator, and local historian.
Our featured guest today is Ghassan Zeineddine. Ghassan Zeineddine was born in Washington, D.C. and raised in the Middle East. He's an assistant professor of creative writing at Oberlin College and co-editor of the creative nonfiction anthology Hadha Baladuna, Arab-American Narratives of Boundary and Belonging. He lives with his wife and two daughters in Ohio, and his book of short stories, Dearborn, is published by Tin House Books. Welcome, Ghassan.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here.
Oh, it's our pleasure. So please tell us a little bit about yourself as a writer. How did you develop your fiction writing, and whose writing inspired yours?
Yeah, so it's interesting because I guess it started back. I've always enjoyed reading, but I didn't really become an obsessive reader until I was about 18, 19 when I was in college. But what happened was so when I was in middle school and high school in Washington, D.C., I was really into wrestling. I was obsessed with wrestling. And for me, it was also important in the sense that my sister and I were the only Arabs in the school. As you mentioned in the intro, we grew up in the Middle East. And so, like many immigrant kids, I felt like an outsider. But my identity as a wrestler was something that was very concrete. And and I remember when I was a sophomore in high school, I was 15 years old. One of the assistant coaches, who's also an English teacher and had also wrestled at Princeton, he gave me this essay by John Irving called "The Half-Pound Piece of Toast." And it was it was an essay it was a nonfiction essay about a time when John Irving, the American writer, went to this wrestling tournament where one of his friends and co-teammates or teammates didn't make weight for this big wrestling tournament because he ate a piece of toast at a rest stop. And that essay, I was just so gripped by it. And I was like, and then that someone could express wrestling, on the page so vividly. And then I ended up reading The World According to Garp, John Irving's fourth novel, which combines writing and wrestling. And so I thought to myself, oh my goodness, you could be a writer and a wrestler, And then so I got some offers to wrestle in college. And I had a full ride to one university to wrestle there. And my parents, they being like Arab parents, we weren't used to like in America, it's so common that you leave home for college. And that wasn't happening like in our household. We weren't used to that kind of custom. And so my parents were very adamant about me staying in DC. And they were really worried about me wrestling in college because they knew how obsessed I was about it. And they were worried if you just pursue wrestling, you're not gonna, your studies are gonna come second. And they were worried about that. So very loving parents, but they prohibited me from pursuing wrestling in college. So I gave it up. And that was really hard. But then, so I had this huge void. And I needed another obsession. And I turned back to, reading and then reading and writing became, my new obsession. So ever since then, like I haven't stopped, and so one influence is actually John Irving, because I really appreciate the way that he speaks to the human condition through comedy and absurdity. And his characters are very whimsical, so I've always kind of taken to that. Other writers, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Jeanette Winterson. There's so many. I feel as if I get new influences like over the course of time. Just recently, I've been reading Percival Everett, who's just like I just think is a remarkable writer. He has a new book out called James. Donna Tartt. There's so many Toni Morrison. There's just so many other influences. So
That's a list of many of my favorites you just read off. So perfect.
yeah.
So, so now, how do you balance the fiction writing with the creative nonfiction in your editing work?
Yeah, it's interesting. I've been I really am primarily a fiction writer, but I do a nonfiction on the side. And since like the Dearborn book came out, I've been doing more essays about Dearborn, about the Arab American community. But it's interesting. It kind of speaks to the story collection, the Hadha Baladuna, that came out in 2022, and that is a book of creative nonfiction essays and a few poems by Arab American writers from the Detroit metropolitan area. So in the book, there are essays by Palestinian writers, Iraqi writers, Yemeni writers, Lebanese writers. And I thought, I really enjoyed working on that book. I have an essay in that book, but my primary role was as the editor, one of the editors of the book. And for me, that was important because I saw myself as a facilitator. And we were bringing these really important voices from different Arab ethnicities. And I wasn't telling their stories. Like I wasn't telling the Iraqi story or the Yemeni story or Palestinian story. The writers themselves from those respective communities were telling their own stories. And for me, that was really important, that we're speaking to a diverse range of writers and everyone is speaking for their own community. So like and that relates to like when I first started writing the story collection Dearborn, I put all this pressure on myself. I said I have to show how diverse the community is. There's so many different Arab ethnicities. But then I thought to myself, but I'm so familiar with the Lebanese community, being a Lebanese myself, and there was a part of me that said, I don't want to tell like a Palestinian story, or Iraqi story. I want writers from those communities to tell their own stories. And so I found my role as editor, one of the editors of the Creative Nonfiction Anthology. It just really afforded me that really important task of bringing other voices to the page. Yeah, but I still work, and what I would say also, it was helpful. I remember I was editing the book, and while I was writing the story collection, and I found that it's helpful to have like two main projects simultaneously. So, let's say you're working intensely on one project, and then you might need some time away from it. Maybe you need to revise it, but before you revise it, it's always a good thing to kind of have some time away from it to gain a fresh perspective. Or even if, let's say, you're working on something so intensely and then it kind of runs out of steam for a bit, you can switch to the other project. So I've always found that helpful to have, a couple projects that I'm working on.
So, what's your writing routine like? Do you carve time out after work, or do you need a certain setting or atmosphere?
Yeah, no, I usually I write in the mornings. It's really helpful. But, I teach full time at the college. And this semester is particularly intense. So it's hard to find, and like it's always great to have like a block that you carve out just to write. But this particular semester, I found that I'm just trying to find pockets of time wherever I can find them, and then just training myself to just write. That I don't need, a perfect setting, like the exact same time block. Sometimes it's like, oh, I have 45 minutes between classes. Maybe I can just revise a page or two. Maybe I can write one paragraph. At this point, it's a matter of just really finding pockets of time. Over the winter and summer breaks, I have more time. I can kind of adhere to that schedule where I wake up early in the morning um, and write. So yeah, sometimes I can't write every single day. But yeah.
Earlier, you touched on the idea of identity that runs through your stories and sort of the diversity of identities that exist in the community in Dearborn. Um, do you think that the Lebanese community of Dearborn that lives there has kind of its own culture? Does it exist separately from other cultures in the Middle East, perhaps?
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And I would say like in Dearborn, so there's so many different Arab ethnicities, Lebanese, Yemeni, Iraqi, Palestinian. There are even a few Jordanians and Egyptians, but the main ones are, Lebanese, Iraqi, the Yemeni and Palestinian communities. And, we have a lot of cultural similarities, right? A common language, although we have different dialects, common food, um, common cultural traditions and practices, but we are also different in our own ways, you know? So that's what's interesting too about them, that there are similarities, but there are also differences. The Lebanese community in Dearborn and the Detroit metropolitan area is by far the largest, but that's also because the Lebanese community has been there the longest since the end of the like from the late 1800s all till the present day. So it's definitely, it's the most established community, but at the same time, the Yemeni community is thriving, as is the Iraqi community. And now, Dearborn now is an Arab majority city. Um, so it's really interesting. And what's interesting about though, about, particularly the Lebanese community in Dearborn, the majority of the community of the Lebanese community in specifically in Dearborn and in Dearborn Heights, which is another city that is just west of Dearborn, is that a lot of those Lebanese come from the southern Lebanon, and that's a direct result of the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982. That you had thousands and thousands of Lebanese who were just fleeing the war, and they came to Dearborn. So you have a big contingent of Lebanese who are from those particular areas. Yeah. And so you might see, it's really interesting because in Dearborn you might hear accents that like a Lebanese accent that is associated with the South, in Lebanon or particular villages. And so that's what makes it like really unique as well.
One result of your characters leaving their home country
Yeah.
is they have, and I found this in various immigrant communities in
Yeah.
Canada too, is there's an often idealized past
Yeah.
becomes a theme with your characters.
Right.
In the story Speedo Man, for
Yeah.
example, you take on the different perspectives of a group of wives and then their husbands as they socialize. And there's a funny and wry take on a lost sense of romance that clashes with culture. What is it about the idea of movie styles and Danielle Steele romance novel genres that you wanted to capture on behalf of your characters?
Yeah, in that particular story, like you said, it's a group of five wives and five husbands, and they're at this the Ford Community Center, and there's like this big swimming pool, and the husbands they really like they hog the jacuzzi area or the jacuzzi, and their wives are in the pool, and one day the stranger appears, and the wives and the men refer to him as Speedo Man, and on the back of his speedos are these nostalgic images of Lebanon. And for that part, I wanted to play on this idea of home, um, and I mean and nostalgia. I wanted to play with the feeling of nostalgia, because like you were just saying, in your question, part of as a writer, part of the danger of writing about one's ancestral home is that you can kind of go into nostalgia, right? And you can kind of maybe not give the most accurate version of your home because you long for it and you miss it so much that you might idolize it. So I kind of wanted to play on that. But I also wanted to show that, although the husbands and their wives have been living in Dearborn for so long, they still really pined for Lebanon. That's still their home. So I didn't want to get caught in the trap of nostalgia. So I use like comedy and absurdity to kind of, find a way in. But in terms of like identity, I think what's so interesting about Dearborn particularly is that I really see it as more of like a transnational city. And so residents in Dearborn, they consider themselves American, and they also consider themselves Arabs, and particularly, like, specifically Lebanese, that they don't necessarily have to feel that they have to choose between one or the other. And in Dearborn, I mean, what's so fascinating about Dearborn is that I would encounter second and third generation Arab American students whose Arabic was, at least their spoken Arabic, was fluent. And they spoke Arabic, without an accent, as if they were native Arabic speakers. So in a lot of, and also just like the city itself, especially the east part of the city, which is predominantly Arab, you see store signs in Arabic, Arab stores, restaurants, coffee shops, you name it. So you almost feel that you're in the Arab world. Like I would walk into grocery stores, cafes. I wouldn't know whether or not to speak in English or Arabic. So I think that sense of you feel that you're in the Arab world, but at the same time you're in an American city, and that lends itself to having like this like transnational identity that you're Arab, you're American. And there is also, a lot of people left Lebanon, but that doesn't mean like when you leave the country. I mean, there's always like this, like the immigrant story, like you leave your ancestral home and that's it. You kind of make a new life somewhere else. But I think going back and forth is really common in Dearborn, not just with the Lebanese community, but the Iraqi and Yemeni community. However, obviously, that's a financial expense. Not everyone has the finances to kind of go back and forth between the Arab world and Dearborn. And in some cases, like now, I mean, you can't go back to Palestine. You can't go back to Lebanon. I mean, we were going to go to Lebanon this over in December, but obviously we can't right now. So it also depends on the political situation. Sometimes you can't go back.
The juxtaposition of culture in Dearborn goes back much further than we might realize, and you illustrate this in the story of the old woman in Marseille.
Yeah.
We don't want to give away any spoilers, but this unique story tells about a survivor of the Titanic. How did you learn about this history, and why did you want to include it in your work?
Yeah, it's so interesting because I came across this scholarly book that came out that was all about the Arab passengers on the Titanic. I thought it was just fascinating. Yeah. And so many of those passengers came from like the Levant area, I mean, at Lebanon. And the book just documented all these passengers with their names, their family members, and they were all, in the third class cabins. And when you think of like the Titanic, you don't always think of like the immigrant communities who are on the boat. Um, and so I wanted to kind of almost pay tribute to the Arab passengers who were on the Titanic, but at the same time, it was important to me in writing Dearborn. I did also want to show um, the evolution of the city and how it's changed over so many decades. And that the Arab presence in Dearborn dates back to like I was saying earlier, the late 1800s, right? Um, and then it wasn't until the Ford Motor Company started paying its employees about $5 a day in 1914 that you start to get even more waves of Arab immigrants to the area. And so with that story, it's set. So the narrator, she is a 99-year-old Titanic survivor, and she's being interviewed by this young Arab American journalist. And it's set in the late 1990s, and like right around the time that Titanic, the movie, came out with Kate Winslet and Leonardo DiCaprio. And I remember that time vividly because it was such a huge hit. Everyone was talking about the Titanic. Um, and so I wanted to show you, and so when the narrator is reflecting on her experience, she also touches on an important neighborhood in Dearborn called the South End of Dearborn in around like in the early 20th century. And the South End, that's where you have the Ford Rouge factory, the Ford Motor Company factory, and so many like the Arab um population in Dearborn, like it started in the South End. And as the Arab community got, bigger, they started to spread in other areas in Dearborn, like East Dearborn and then West Dearborn. And then they even started moving out to Dearborn Heights. But so I also wanted to pay tribute to the south end of that neighborhood of Dearborn because it's so important. That's what really started the community.
Awesome.
Yeah.
It's a great character. So many of your characters, like this lady in that story, are storytellers themselves,
Yeah.
or their descriptions of storytelling. How does that tradition influence your writing, and how does it manifest in your teaching of creative writing, say?
Yeah, it's so interesting. I think it's so, I mean, so that story, like the Marseille story, the Titanic story, it's almost like it's an oral narrative because she's actually telling the story and the journalist is recording it. And oral storytelling is just so important in Arab culture. It dates even back to the Quran, you're right? It was like recited. It was like an oral story that was recited. Um, and so, and I think it just dates even in our family. You know, my paternal grandfather, he in Lebanon, he was born in Lebanon, but he grew up in Jerusalem, and then he returned to Lebanon and he worked in a printing press. And he would just tell me all these stories, like incredible stories of just growing up in Jerusalem. And back then there weren't any borders, kind of going back and forth between Palestine and Lebanon. Beirut in 1930s, 40s, 50s. And it's really interesting because he lived a long life. He lived until the age of 95. And what was so interesting about his stories was that they always were told with a sense of urgency, in the sense that he'd always tell me, this might be the last story I tell you. I might be dead tomorrow. So, and he did that for 20 years. Like he literally prepared me for his own death because he'd always say, "You got to listen to this because I'm gonna be dead. I'm probably gonna be dead by the next time you visit me." But he wasn't, so he'd always tell me these stories. Um, so I grew up with this like idea of storytelling. And I think also with my students, and so for instance, I'm teaching this one course called The Art of Podcasting. It's a creative writing course, and like in the first part of the semester, their first major assignment was actually to interview a resident from the town and to just kind of get their story. And I told them, people love to tell their stories. They really do. They just need a listener. Um, and they found that that was the case. So they got like these really interesting stories from these community members, and the community members were telling their own stories, you know. So yeah, it always seeps into my teaching, and I even tell them that even let's say just be aware, be cognizant of your world. Like being a writer doesn't mean just like staying, in your basement and just trying to write all the time. Like you have to be exposed to different voices, different experiences, and just keep your ears open, your eyes open to the way that people communicate with one another. And these stories are being told every single day. And you might hear like a snippet of dialogue that, from someone, and it just kind of, triggers a thought in your mind that might lead to a story. So, yeah, that's always been a big part of my teaching and even my own writing.
Your story about your grandfather kind of caught my attention. I've had relatives like that too. It's a sense of urgency tinged with guilt, I think. Yeah, isn't it?
Yeah,
There's a
right.
little bit of that.
Yeah, yeah.
All right. Some of your characters have reoccurring roles in various stories. Did you have a novel format in mind for this collection, or was it always intended to be linked stories?
It was always intended to be linked stories. But I knew I was working on a linked story collection, but at the time I really didn't see the whole. And I told myself I just have to take it one story at a time. And when I have most of them down, then I'll start to see more links. And that's really what happened. Um, and then I was really just so fortunate enough to work with a brilliant editor. And so she also suggested a few links that I didn't see myself. And so we worked that in too. and that's the fun part. And I mean, the thing about making the links work is that you also want to make them subtle. Because if you make them too obvious, you kind of show your hand as a writer. And it's really and hopefully it's fun for the reader to kind of, you know, find these links, as they're reading the stories. And it's also just to kind of show that this is like a really strong community, that you're gonna see the same people in and out. And like for instance, like certain streets keep coming up, like Ford Avenue, Michigan Avenue, Schaefer, Warren Avenue, because those are like the main roads, avenues in the city. And so those come up quite often. And then yeah, sometimes like a character from one story reappears in another story in a very like subtle way. And then I have recurring images. Like there are a lot of billboards that come up in the story collection, because Dearborn has, like, it's so interesting, all these billboards like promoting Arab American businesses. And so that was something I wanted to also capture in the collection. And one way to do that is by having these recurring images. But speaking of my brilliant editor, her name is Elizabeth DeMio. It's really funny because early on in the editing process, when she was going over the book, the Ford Rouge factory it's actually on the cover of the book. So that's a 1953 postcard picture so I'm holding up the cover of the book, and on the cover is a 1953 picture of the Ford Rouge factory, because so many of the Dearborn residents worked at the factory, or they at least worked at the factory for a few years before moving on to something else and starting their own businesses. So I knew that, okay, the factory is going to play a big role in the story collection. And I wasn't even aware of it, but in several consecutive stories, like the main character was always like a factory worker. And my editor said, as important as a factory is, you don't have to have every character working at the factory. I think readers will get the hint. If you have like one repetition, that's enough. You don't have to have like every story feature like a character from the factory. But yeah, but other than that, there are a lot of other recurring images. But yeah, I never thought of it as a novel, because what a story collection can offer that a novel necessarily cannot is you can play with different tones in a story collection. Like in a novel, you want to have a consistent tone, a consistent narrative tone. Whereas in a story collection, you can kind of get away with having different tones. And just playing with so many different perspectives, different timelines. I'm not saying that a novel can't do that, but with a story collection, it's a lot easier to pull that off.
Well, that's awesome. Are you working on anything now? Another short story collection or something different?
Yeah, I am. So I like earlier in our conversation, I mentioned like the word obsession. I was mentioning obsession with wrestling that led to obsession with reading and writing. And so I write about my obsessions, and my obsession is still Dearborn, like right after this call. It's so funny. Right before getting on this call with you all, my wife called me, and my parents, her parents are in town from Lebanon. They're just staying with us. And she said, let us go to Dearborn this weekend. It's only about 2 hours away. And so I said, yes, of course, let's all go. And so I'm still so obsessed with Dearborn. It's such an important city to me. And so I'm working on like two projects. One is another story collection that is actually set in Lebanon and in Dearborn. And it's important that it's not like Dearborn Part 2. It has to offer something different. And so several of the stories are set in Lebanon. And then some stories are actually set in Dearborn, but it's a different kind of, I mean, there's still that tragicomic tone that I employ, but it's not like just, oh, here are the next 10 stories from Dearborn. It's something a bit different. Another thing that I've been working on, but it's still in its infancy, is I've been really interested in the genre of the crime novel. Yeah, because I think it like the crime novel is so interesting. It can really speak to social political matters in an interesting way. And I really am a firm believer, I mean, literature can offer us so many different things. And one important thing to me as a writer is to actually entertain the reader. Like I really want the reader to have fun reading like my stories. So for the past several years I've been reading a whole lot of crime novels, getting used to how they work. And I've been thinking about a crime novel set in Dearborn, um, specifically at a restaurant in Dearborn. I've been doing some research on it, but it's still really early.
Well, we'd love to have you read some of your work for us. Would you like to set up a selection from Dearborn?
Yeah, sure. I was thinking I could read the opening to this short story called Money Chickens. And I'll just preface the story. Actually, the opening of the short story will kind of set the premise, but it's about, it's a story that follows a father and his son. The story is narrated by the son, and the father has been saving. He's been working, side jobs, and he saves his money, his cash earnings inside of chickens. Like he stuffs his cash earnings inside of chickens, and then he freezes the chickens because he doesn't want to report these cash earnings to the IRS, right? He wants to save the money in order to build a home back home in Lebanon. And this story was inspired by, it's funny because I think this happens a lot in Arab culture, but at least our family, and that is like this habit of always hiding your personal belongings inside the house. I know, like you can hide it in a bank safe, but like in our family, there's always like how to hide your jewelry really in a place that if someone were to break into the house, they wouldn't find it. So we had this one family friend. She was Syrian, and I'm really not kidding. She had this she would hide her jewelry inside of an empty whipped cream canister, and she put it in the fridge. So it was like who would ever think of jewelry inside of a whipped cream canister? So and I've actually inherited that habit of hiding my belongings. So what I do is like with my laptop. So I save everything on like iCloud, Google Drive. I have backups, but I'm still petrified. I think to myself like, okay, what if we're out of the house and someone breaks into our house? What if they steal the laptop that has my work on it? I don't want to I don't want to lose that. So I have this strange habit of just hiding my laptop in weird places inside the house so no one can find like one spot is we have an armchair and I hide it under the cushion. One friend suggested I just hide it in the fireplace because someone's not going to look for belongings inside a fireplace. So I do that a lot. So that kind of inspired the story about this idea of like hiding your personal belongings, right? Okay. So so here it goes. So again, the story is titled Money Chickens, and it's narrated by the son. Some folks store their money in safes. Baba used chickens. I was 6 the first time I saw him shove a Ziploc bag filled with bills inside a chicken in the kitchen of our two-bedroom house in East Dearborn one evening back in 1988. He sat at the table wearing yellow rubber gloves that reached halfway up his forearms, a cigarette dangling from his lips. The chicken lay on the cutting board. A small man with small hands, Baba had no problem thrusting his fists into the bird's bowels. He then sheathed the body in plastic wrap and placed it in the freezer. He slipped off his gloves, dropped them in the sink, and sat back down at the table to finish his cigarette. I reached inside my pocket and pulled out my pack of candy cigarettes. I loved the first puffs because I was able to produce smoke made of powdered sugar, smoke that merged with Baba's in a ghostly swirl that hung over us like a shared thought. Police sirens wailed in the distance. Baba looked out the window. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, he said. I repeated his prayer, looking at his reflection in the window pane, the plump bags under his eyes, his thick mustache with curled tips. His face sagged with exhaustion. I had those very same bags under my eyes, giving me a somber, contemplative look for a boy so young. I had been named after Baba's father, Ali. There's trouble in Detroit, Baba said. He had had a loud voice, developed from years of yelling over the sound of machines at the Ford Rouge plant, where he worked. Detroit was a few blocks east. "We have to hide our money from the thieves across the border," he said. I removed my cigarette from my mouth. "Are we safe here, Baba?" "We'll be safer once we return to Lebanon. That's what the money chicken is for, to build ourselves a house back home." The money Baba made at the plant was barely enough to keep us afloat back then, not with a mortgage and the recent arrival of my baby sister. For the past month before her birth, he had been working odd jobs on the weekend to make extra cash, mostly as a handyman. But I saw him solely as a car maker. Whenever I spotted a Ford sedan or truck on the road, I suspected Baba had had a hand in its making. The only home I knew was Dearborn, where I was born and raised. My parents had immigrated to America in 1982, 7 years into their home country's gruesome civil war. That evening in the kitchen with Baba, I was too young to point out this fallacy. How was Lebanon safer than America when Lebanese were killing one another in the streets? Mama entered the kitchen, holding my sister in her arms. Her long black hair was parted down the middle. She wore her hijab over her shoulders like a shawl, always prepared to wrap it around her head in the event that a male neighbor came calling. She was a tall, big-boned woman who towered over Baba and me. She sniffed the air. "I smell raw meat," she said. The cutting board was still on the table. "I found a new hiding place to safeguard our money," Baba said, and explained his stuffing. Mama's eyes widened. She opened the freezer and looked inside. "Allah have mercy," she said. "Don't worry," Baba said. "The chicken is halal. We can keep your pearl necklace and gold bracelets inside of one." "I prefer the bank safe," Mama said. Baba looked at me, telling me through his tired eyes that this chicken business would remain a father-son affair. We communicated in a private language similar to the one used between lovers. I looked back, telling him I understood. We reached for another cigarette at the same time.
That's wonderful. Thank you so
Thanks.
much for your time, Ghassan Zeineddine. His latest book is Dearborn, Short Stories, and it's wonderful. You should check it out. Thanks
Thanks so
again.
much. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for joining us. Look for more episodes of All Right in Sin City wherever you listen to podcasts, or check out our website, allrightinsincity.com. For information and announcements of new podcasts, sign up to our email list or follow us on Facebook and Twitter.